me to just briefly introduce the session. Okay, and so I'm pleased to introduce Practicing Ethics in Qualitative Research in Psychology, a roundtable discussion, which is chaired by Nico Canoy from Ateneo de Manila University. And Nico, I'll hand it over to you and allow you to introduce the discussion.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Zach. So good day or good evening to everyone. I'm the moderator for this RTD roundtable discussion on practicing ethics in qualitative research in psychology. My name is Dr. Nico from the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. So I'll begin with the overview, just an overview of the RTD. This roundtable discussion involves learning from situated practices of research ethics in psychology in both academic and applied contexts. As an engaged space of co-learning, discussants will explore diverse issues, challenges, and insights, reflections from their own experience related to concepts or concepts related to vulnerability, collaboration, and decolonizing practices to healing and recovery among marginalized groups in distinct contexts. Example, patients, refugees, HIV persons, among others. The overall focus of the discussion centers on surfacing and elaborating on some key ethical issues and challenges faced by scholars, psychologists, and practitioners in the Global South in the conduct of qualitative research in terms of 3 domains, because we only have an hour to talk about ethics, and ethics is a big topic, which cuts across different methodologies. So the 3 broad domains are knowledge production, teaching, and intervention. So there. So in terms of the composition of our RTD and the discussion flow, so right now we have 3 out of the 4 discussants. So let me introduce them for you. So we have 3 discussants from for our RTD coming from 3 countries in Southeast Asia. I'll introduce each one, then I'll give them around 5 minutes max to share a brief summary. Of course, they have given their provided their videos for you. So brief summary or key points of their work related to ethics and qualitative research. So the flow is an introduction is given, then followed by a 5-minute sharing. Is that okay? And then we move to the next discussant. Then we open the floor. So afterwards, I'll open the discussion with a broad question, which anyone can answer. The discussion is free-flowing. So the discussants are encouraged to engage and build on each other's points. I also encourage our audience to type their questions in the chat box, which I'll read from time to time. Zach can also help me read some of the comments and questions if I miss some. You can direct your question to everyone in the group or to a specific discussant. So we have 60 minutes for this RTD. Is that okay? Okay. So let's move to introducing our discussants. So our first discussant is Dr. Seng Fatong from Malaysia. Dr. Tong is an academic primary care physician from the Department of Family Medicine, University Kanbasan, Malaysia. His research interests include doctors' practice behavior in health screening, men's health, and chronic care. He teaches undergraduate and postgraduate students on the specialty of family medicine since 2004. He also teaches research methodology of qualitative and quantitative research. He was the past chair of the Malaysian Primary Care Research Group and the immediate past president of Qualitative Research Association in Malaysia. Hello, Tong. Welcome.
Yeah,
so you begin with your 5-minute sharing.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Nico. I guess this is an interesting forum because there are so many disciplines here. And obviously, I'm coming from healthcare, so I probably will speak just 5 minutes about ethical issues in quality studies on my discipline. And we will invite discussion. So I intend to just bring in 2 issues. Let me see if I move my slide. Yep. So I just going to talk about 2 issues. There are obviously many things. The first is untold stories, because when we engage in qualitative study and data collection, it may be narrative stories or interviews, focus group, or even pictures and different types of data on. And we often encounter unexpectedly some stories, and how do we as a researcher deal with them? And the second is, of course, the conflicts while we are recruiting participants. From healthcare perspective, is pretty interesting because our participants are mostly vulnerable because they're down with illness. So there are power struggle between researcher and practitioner and the patient. So there are three parties are involved. So sometimes we ask our practitioner colleagues to introduce us the patient for our study, and that can also create tension. So the untold stories, what are those? Basically, things that is pretty sensitive sometimes. For example, clinical diagnosis that is never been reviewed because of our relationship with the participant and our trust relationship we develop. A lot of time, abuse, depression, things like that can come about. And how do we deal with that as a researcher? And we are not a therapist at that particular session. Of course, violation to national rules, those comes in. And again, how do we deal with that? And often very unexpectedly. And a mismanagement by healthcare providers. They're talking about, doctors prescribing wrongly and, things like that. So how do we deal with all this particular difficult situation? I guess when we come to this, we need to take ourselves clear about what's our role here. So if we are clear on our role and we put forward what we can offer to our participant in the study, then we are a little bit more comfort. But there's no straight answer. Really, there's no straight answer. We come in as a scientist. We come in also sometimes therapists, for example, in healthcare providers and counselor in psychology. We are therapists, and we are also a citizen of a country. So we have to abide to rules as well as our role as treatment. And sometimes we intentionally some advice are given. So therefore, it calls for a very intricate balance between these three roles. Yeah. So as scientists, we have our own agenda. We want the best maximum of information, but therapists want to heal the patient. So that's a conflict. And of course, citizens want to be a good citizen of not violating the rules. The second issue raised is getting the patient to be our patient, to be our participant. So as I said, there's a struggle between power relationship. And of course, from an Asian culture, the power relationship can be even more. And because we may respect the certain profession in the world, for example, a therapist might stand a higher position in its power in society compared to participant. And there's tendency for them as being vulnerable to agree to participate in the study. So the tension really grows between patient and healthcare workers and healthcare providers, because they are the source of recruitment sometimes. And that calls for a long-term relationship. Will that be jeopardizing relationship if they disagree or agree? And of course, the researcher and healthcare providers, we also have a colleague relationship. And will that be affecting that? So we need to be very clear in front and how can we deal with it, and being neutral in a sense. But truly neutral as being human is sometimes can be very difficult. Of course, researcher and patient, there's data quality involved in data collection, and therefore our relationship involved. So that can be tricky. So taking both in a sense, moving forward is kind of a learning journey for most of us. Being critical is easily said and done sometimes, and we learn from the start. And therefore, we have to endure the long journey of reshaping and reflecting, and being aware of our interests, where is our agenda. And of course, we always talk about participant interests come first. And we really have to reflect whether, how true that is reflected in our act. Yeah. So I guess that's probably the end. We'll call for debate and see whether we have difficulty in both sides, and we can discuss how we can deal together. Yeah. Thanks, Nico. I think that's all I'm going to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Tong. We'll discuss more on that, the multiple roles that we play, aside from being a researcher, and how that impacts how our relationship with our participants, and at the same time, our client in your case. Yeah. So we'll talk more on that. So the next discussant is Miss Kim Nguyen from Vietnam. Ms. Kim Nguyen is a doctoral candidate at the City University of New York in the Critical Social and Personality Psychology program. Kim graduated from the Human Development and Social Intervention Master's Program at the New York University, and her research interests are in the critical refugee studies, transnational feminist research, child development within social, historical, and cultural context, political war trauma, and decolonizing healing practices. Kim's most recent research uses qualitative methods to reveal the political and social-cultural dynamics that shape Afghan women refugees' experiences. As a child refugee, Kim is particularly interested in examining how ethics can be integrated into every step of conducting psychological research with refugee population. Hello, Kim. Welcome. You may begin with your 5-minute sharing.
Hi, everyone. I don't think I'll even need the whole 5 minutes. So I will just sort of give a quick introduction. But Nico, as you already said, I went to NYU in Human Development and Social Intervention. And, you know, I think the more that I was digging into psychological research with marginalized groups, the more I felt that there was so much complexity that was sort of lacking in the majority of the work being done in quantitative methods. And so it was really during my master's where I discovered what we could offer with qualitative work, qualitative methods. And my desire to be extremely sensitive to ethical issues, because so my family, you know, I was born in Vietnam. Our family moved to the United States as refugees. So I was a child refugee at 5 years old. But at the same time, most of my development has happened in the United States. And I went to NYU, and then I am in a PhD program. So at the same time, even though I would be considered an insider and perhaps, maybe seen as someone who has more sensitivity and more of a strong radar when it comes to ethics in working with marginalized groups, because I've grown up in the United States and because I've been swimming in Western ideologies and American ideologies about how the world is constructed, it's impossible, right, to always be aware of the ways that dominant ideologies actually operate through me. And so, you know, that means that I consistently feel pressure to, you know, constantly be doing a process of reflexivity, like from each stage, to really make sure that I'm not, you know, assuming another person's experience, even because my family had possibly similar experiences. And so ethics has been at really like a compass for me in doing qualitative research. And I think qualitative research has been brilliant in really allowing me to really delve deeply into the complexities of stories and acknowledging the fact that, you know, they're complex. It's not always a story of loss. It's not always a story of struggle. It also includes stories of transformation. It also includes stories of growth. And how do we acknowledge all of that complexity in ways that, honor the stories that are shared with us, while maintaining incredible sensitivity to power and how power is operating in all of these spaces. So that's all I'll say for myself. I currently do research now with Afghan refugees, and that's another thing that, and why I have to be extremely conscious and mindful at each step of the way, because even though I'm a refugee, and even though there are some similarities with the United States military imperialist aggression, but it doesn't mean that I will always have an awareness of all of the nuances of another refugee group. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. So I think it extends the idea of multiple roles from multiple to intersectional in a way, no? So as you said, you cannot be aware of everything. There's a blind spot, and maybe we can discuss more on the implications on those intersections and complications later on, no? And I'm just thinking on top of mind when we talk about the global south knowledge production. It's not a singular knowledge production coming from your own experience, maybe, no? So we can talk more of that later.
Especially for those who have been trained in the West.
Yeah.
Research in the global south.
So in some spaces they call it more hybridized forms of knowledge, but still I think the term that you mentioned a while ago about power and how that we're not talking about equal differences when we talk about power. It's unequal differences. No, and I mean let's open that space for more discussion later. But thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kim. So let's move to our last discussion for this RTD. Our last discussant is Ms. Augil Robles from the University of the Philippines. She is an assistant professor for the Division of Social Sciences of the University of the Philippines, Visayas. She advocates for the potential of qualitative methodologies and shared reflexivity in enriching scientific inquiry and empowering various communities. Her research applies social psychological perspectives to understand people's discourse and embodied and place experiences of health. Collaborating with fellow psychology scholars and civic organizations in capacity building and research projects, introduce her to the joys and growing pains of interdisciplinary critical health research, leading to publications in international peer-reviewed journals. She is currently looking for opportunities to pursue a doctoral degree to further explore these passions. Hello, Augil, welcome. You may begin with your 5-minute sharing.
Hello, Sir Nico. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's my first time in this engagement, and I value this learning opportunity as well. So it is an honor to be sharing some thoughts and insights on relational ethics for compassionate research. And much of what I shared in my presentation were driven by my experiences so far in doing qualitative HIV research here in the Philippines. So reflecting on my experiences, qualitative research is rife with intimate encounters that call for the mindful exercise of ethics. And moreover, the depth and sensitivity of encounters in qualitative research requires a relational ethics that goes beyond simply doing no harm. Rather, one that acknowledges our interpersonal bonds to others and seeks to deal with our changing relationships with research participants across situations and over time. And so relational ethics invites us to follow an ethics of care in taking a person-centered approach that not only protects our participants, but empowers them by addressing power asymmetries and acknowledging the co-production of knowledge through the meeting of our shared and perhaps distinct reflexivities. Relational ethics requires that we make these mindful decisions and take deliberate actions so that we can care about, care for, and care with others as we do qualitative research. So to demonstrate how relational ethics may be applied in practice, I shared my attempts to care for different persons that I have interviewed in doing HIV research here in the Philippines. Most of them are members of the LGBT community, as well as some of their support networks. To fully understand where persons living with HIV are coming from in having to navigate a number of perceived and actual risks as they consent to sharing the most intimate and profound aspects of their lives. This is an invitation to reflect about how can we protect and empower them throughout the process without undermining their contribution to our science? And I borrow the work of Wei and Tracy, who conceptualized how we can communicate compassion. No? And they have a very conversational approach to this. And they said that doing this is first through recognizing. It's paying attention to what's going on and seeing the whole person. It's reading the details of their emotions, the relational cues, and trying to figure out what that means. Second would be being compassionate through relating, where we can find and establish a common ground with our participants through listening, feeling, and making connections. And finally, we can also be compassionate by reacting, where we can be communicating compassionately in a proactive or in a reactive manner. So I found that through these core communicative actions, listening deeply and sharing vulnerably on both sides of the research encounter allows us to satisfy not only the goals of our study, but also the purpose of creating that space for both myself as a researcher and the participants to heal and grow in one way or another. And to end, I present some ethical reflections on the emerging challenges of how can we practice relational ethics in remote research encounters. Since in many nations like ours in the Philippines, the pandemic is still a very salient reality for us and our research participants. So this is also to open the discussion on how can we care for our participants in a way that can transcend face-to-face encounters. So thank you.
Thank you, Augil. Of course, I'm biased to care theory, right? So, but that's an interesting point on caring encounters and weaving that to the earlier points of our previous discussions on multiple and intersectional roles. And I just wonder how maybe how can we care for the other while recognizing our own blind spots and our own privileges in that same encounter that we are trying to empower our participants, our clients, our patients. How do we do that? What makes that encounter transformative? A little bit different from our previous encounter. So I think we only have 3 discussions for today. So I'll go straight ahead to our main discussion. So as I've said, it's free flowing. I'll just give a broad question. We can divide that into 3 dimensions. So the question is based on your thoughts, reflections. What do you think are the key ethical issues and challenges faced by scholars, psychologists, and practitioners in the global South, in the conduct of qualitative research in terms of, we'll divide that. First, we'll talk about knowledge production, maybe for 10 to 15 minutes. You can draw from your own personal experience or observations from your peers and colleagues, and we can discuss that. As I've said, our audience are free to type their comments, questions in the chat box, and then we will pick it up and discuss those questions too. Anyone can start. So knowledge production first. Then we move to teaching and then intervention. Of course, all of these things are interconnected, right? We have multiple roles. So you can also begin elsewhere, right? You can bring in everything all at once. That's all. That depends on you.
Yeah, let's start first with the knowledge production. Of course, being a scientist, if you like, to call ourselves an investigative in many ways, we want to produce knowledge as much as we want. And one of the things that we, over the years, we discover that ourselves need to be careful about the greed for knowledge. That's something that is very difficult sometimes to draw the line. Because as we dig into the stories and the details, for example, once I interview doctors why they are doing research and why they are not doing research, because doing research in an academic setting, it can be quite a big pressure. So we are pushed in the questions of why understanding doing research, why are they not doing research and publishing, And I have an encounter that doctors coming back and tell us that I'm not you. You know, well, that response startled me and say, I want to find out the reason, the knowledge and the evidence why they're doing that. And that question threw me off and say, I am not you, I am me. So it goes back to the role again. And so that's a learning experience of how we take a step back and say, have we put our values, you know, as mentioned just now, Kim also talked about it, you know, how we come from might shape the way how we ask our question. And it's a learning experience from participant. And we really have to say that to our participant. I'm here really to learn. Sometimes we say wrong things and we have to co-learn together. So that is our limit that we have to sometimes, we forget sometimes. So yeah, that's my little sharing on that knowledge production bit, I think, yeah.
Thank you, Tong. How about the others?
I could step in. I think one of, you know, the major challenges is to, because, you know, so conducting research in the global South, right? And especially when I'm reading articles that have been conducted in the global South, those articles are written in English. And so that right off the bat already communicates who is actually conducting this, who is accessing that. And so what I really am concerned about is, and I think we touched a little bit about that on yesterday's roundtable, is that are the methodologies that have been mostly designed in American and European context, and even the language that we use in interviewing, are those actually able to be applicable? Are they relevant for people, for populations in the global South? And are they able to actually capture, you know, nuances of what's happening in the global South that are completely, you know, separate from the global North? And I think a lot of the work is usually like global South in conversation with global North. And so how about research that is just centered on global South issues that have, well, and in a globalized world now, I don't think it's really possible to just be thinking about one region without considering its connection to other regions. But then as well, I'm thinking about, you know, what are some methodologies that are emerging from global South context. And I also think about, you know, when I was at NYU and I was a master's student reading, I remember that I had a sense from, you know, academia that research that was conducted by people outside of the United States and Europe had a little less credibility than those that were conducted within the global North. And so what about methodologies that are relevant and emerging from global South, and would they be taken with the same credibility in other, you know, in the global North? So those are some of the things that I've been sort of thinking about when we think about knowledge production.
Thank you, Kim. That's a lot, no? I'll try to summarize that along with Tong's inputs. To talk about first, Tong's touch on, I think it's the infrastructure that supports knowledge production, and to recognize that not everyone can write. I mean, Tong talked about maybe it's you. I mean, you can write. I cannot write because I have other things that I need to attend to, and I think that's more pronounced in certain contexts in the global South, wherein researchers need to wrestle with multiple obligations and realities in their own workplace. No, so it's interesting to think about that and ways to address that. Kim talked about language, and I'll link that to credibility and power, no? And how our current still the mainstream practice in communicating and even producing knowledge is still in English, no? And how to think about other languages that equally can contribute to deepening certain understanding and insights, no, given certain phenomena. And that actually links to, you talked about Southern knowledge vis-a-vis Northern knowledge. I mean, that comparative access, but As you said, can we think about global south from a south-south perspective or a north-north perspective? I mean, not from that easy, not easy, from that typical comparative point of view of knowledge production, no? South versus north or whatever. So there are complexities inherent in global south knowledge production itself, no? As well as global north, definitely. So thank you, Kim. No, we'll, Augil, I think you're, do you want to chime in?
I was listening to Kim earlier, and she floated the question of whether there are other methodologies that are emerging. No, it's interesting because this is the main critique that a line of scholars from the Philippines are currently pursuing. No? And these are scholars who are forwarding indigenous research methodologies aligned with Filipino psychology. And they would like to separate themselves from methods that are indigenized, meaning coming from other cultures that are just adapted and used in the country, versus their methods, which are more driven from indigenous knowledge systems and practices. So one, for example, would be the interview, which we commonly know as having, for example, forms like structured, unstructured, in-depth, with guide questions. No? But here in Filipino psychology, they'd like to think of it as very loosely structured and conversational, because in the communities, you cannot really say that you're going to have a formal conversation just between two people. So you expect that there are others who would come in and join in the conversation, and there are methods to integrate those different perspectives from the locals. So definitely there are, no, and even, for example, other versions on group discussions, no, which we call ginabayang talakayan here in the Filipino psychology. But I think the problem we must acknowledge in order for these methods to flourish, as far as the other more prominent research methodologies are, ones that are more known perhaps to us and our students, is that they have to be practiced and developed further in terms of theory. Or how are we going to communicate the way we conduct and execute these indigenous methodologies to other scholars. No, and there are efforts to do this currently, and we continue, for example, to teach this to our students, no, and we practice this also in some of our research endeavors. But indeed, the challenge remains, no, that perhaps because it is not familiar to many, and that many are already comfortable with the usual methods that we know. This is why these methods are yet to be mainstreamed as far as we would want them to be.
Thank you, Augil. I think we have one question from our audience. Yes, Annie, you can unmute yourself, and then Aritra.
Thank you, speaker. This is a topic which is very close to my heart and my work, and I will share that in a later section. But just sort of extending this whole dilemma around language and communicating research in Global South, what I experimented in my doctoral work was use of art. And of course, art in itself also has a language which is very culturally embedded. So symbols don't necessarily, and symbols don't have the same meaning. But what it helped me was to also overcome my kind of fixation on getting answers in a manner that the research committee, the editors, the people who are going to publish my work accept. And those symbols actually helped me a lot more to get into their lived experiences. And those drawings were, a copy was kept with me, and they took pictures and they kept the copy. They actually don't want to read what I have written eventually, but they want to keep the drawings that we had shared. The drawings I also gave them. And so I wonder if anyone here has used this kind of method or this kind of approach with symbols, and the challenges that they face in communicating the meaning of the symbol, especially when you're trying to address an audience like this, which is very global.
100%. And I love that you just talked about that, because again, we assume that everyone communicates through words and verbally. And so I created and COVID put a big giant stop on this, but I had a second part of a project where we were working with the refugees, and also this is the difficulty, right, of working with other communities and quote unquote giving voice. I hate that. You know, I'm not giving any voice. I'm hopefully creating some platform where they are giving their own voices. But you know, when we are collecting that data and then, you know, writing those papers, it's really funneling through my own interpretation of what's going on. And so how could I operate within academia and do the work that I have to do in order to succeed within Western academia, and at the same time offer a space that was actually going to honor the people that I was actually working with as fellow human beings that had their own you know, agency and voice. And so I created the space where they could go in and create a piece, and they would choose the platform which they created. So whether they told a story, whether they, you know, created a painting, whether they made a sculpture, or whether they made food. I'm sorry, and this is the difficulty. So much of healing in a lot of cultures is centered around food. And I know it's bizarre, but I was thinking about, well, yeah, like if you have a dish that you could create that takes you to a moment, that would be kind of incredible to actually share that. Why don't we do this in multi-sensory kind of ways? And that was creating a space where refugees would be able to, you know, design their own stories and present that story however they wanted to. But I knew that that was something that I think I also had to be careful about, because that isn't something I would want to analyze and I would want to write up, right? Even though I live in psychology and that's the expectation, like at the end of the day, the question becomes like, how are you going to sort of use this for, you know, extending psychological knowledge, which I think is difficult because I think there are some, you know, there are some experiences that deserve to be honored in a way that is not, I don't want to say exploited, but, you know, not sort of funneled into psychological research in some way. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah.
Anyone else before we move to Aritra's? I think Aritra is raising his hand.
I suppose that formal language is a symbol of communication. And I guess putting our participant at ease in some way, that's allow us need to be sensitive to our local culture of different types of communication methods. And I deal with a lot of patients, and silence, now a lot of things to the patients, different groups, for example, adolescent children, their expression way is different. So how do we build ourselves to be more sensitive to the way they communicate? I guess that's the whole idea, I guess. We have to immerse ourselves to that. Generally, you know, there's the rules. Yeah. Sometimes we thought drawing might be the best, but it might turn out the other way around. So I guess it's still coming back to us understanding them. To be locally sensitive, that's interesting.
So sensitivity is key.
In
terms of navigating the modality, no, whether it's verbal, it's by symbols, drawings, and the actual practice. I really like the points on being reflexive on what we're doing, that the actual process of analysis, the distilling of further insights on what is already there, what is already present, is counterproductive to what is at hand or what is at stake in that knowledge production context. Yes, Aritra.
Excellent points, everyone, and it was a pleasure listening to all of you. My question pertains to the uncritical, I don't know, I would not say uncritical, but uncritical theorizing of indigenous knowledge system, or using indigenous knowledge systems without seeing if these knowledge systems could actually be propagating something problematic. Like in India, we have something such as karmic theories, or we have Vedantic or yogic theory, which are inherently casteist in whichever manner you take them. So do you have sort of systems in the Filipino culture, Vietnamese culture, the indigenous knowledge system, which we are saying we must advocate, that might have inherent problems within, inherent power problems within themselves? And then how do you navigate that, dilemma or something?
Yes, anyone? Anyone can? Yes, Augil?
Thank you for that point, Aritra. And also because earlier I brought up indigenous knowledge systems and practices in the Philippines. We do have that. No? For example, another critique of the existing theorization of Filipino psychology is that it's very focused on certain regions and not as inclusive of the other regions. No? And this brings forth a long discourse about the uneven distribution of resources, no, the lack of representation of narratives from other regions. And so one way that we mitigate this is that when we also, like you said, we avoid the uncritical reproduction of what is existing or what has already been said. Instead, we encourage our students to reflect on how we can challenge these given our local experiences, and local meaning the closest to them. So, for example, recently, one of the most interesting happenings in the Philippines is that there are different ways that people from different regions respond to the vaccination initiatives. And the students have different ways of making sense of this. No, others are saying that this is because some are uneducated. No, others are very critical in saying that this is because the vaccines were not equally distributed in the first place. And so pessimism already was breeding in other areas before the vaccine even got there in the first place. No, and so I agree. No, we have to also think that just as these knowledge systems were established under certain conditions and premises, our current social and historical context should continuously inform and revise what we know of, especially when we're talking about matters of culture. So thank you.
Thank you, Augil. Actually, you extended the part of the question of Aritra. No, Aritra asked about the theorizing, the uncritical theorizing of knowledge in indigenous communities. But in your own experience, that theorizing is tied to actual practice, the utilization of knowledge in that community. That's part of the ethical disposition, no, in those contexts. And maybe that's a way to segue to the next domain, which is intervention. Again, all of this knowledge production, intervention, all of these are intersectional, no. But maybe we can talk about more of the some of the issues and challenges from an intervention context in relation to practicing qualitative research. Anyone?
I suppose practicing qualitative research in the local, I mean, I'm from Malaysia, so it's a very slightly different background in a sense, because the British influence is pretty large, and healthcare providers is all in English environment. So I guess the hospitals run in English language, you know, despite being our Malaysia bahasa, our national language. So I guess I kind of learned quite a lot, because I guess from our side, we still have quite a heavy influence, even the way how our practice is very much using, you like the word northern, global north methodology, as well as the practice of using a qualitative research is very much northern. Not so much locally grown, if you like the word to use, in the way how we practice. It's still very much following a traditional text, but with a flavor of local sensitivity of the way how we do things. So I guess from our perspective, we haven't seen, especially from healthcare discipline, I haven't seen differences in the practice. It's just that the way how we deliver it, the methodology is pretty much similar. It is going down to the details of being sensitive of the nuances, then that there might be some differences, but I guess overall, I think they are pretty similar, I guess, from my discipline. Yeah. Nico.
About the others? Anyone? Yes, Kim?
I don't know about intervention, but I'm really compelled with Arita's comment just a minute ago. And I wanted to sort of, speak a little bit more to that, because I love the idea of us really maintaining a critical approach to looking at dominant, powerful ideologies, but at the same time, not assuming that indigenous ideologies don't carry their own problematic ideas, right? And I love that, because in my current project right now, that's what I'm trying to wrestle with. So I'm doing a project on mother's resistance. And in the beginning, I'm coming from an American context. It's extremely easy to criticize American context, right? And American ideas about, being infused with racism and sexism and ableist ideas. So it's really easy to critique. And then at the same time, when I'm looking at refugee populations and looking at, quote unquote, traditional cultural, right, methodologies of or strategies of raising, parenting strategies, they also carry their own problematic ideas. And so how do we, and I really love the visualization of the compass. How do we use a compass that keeps us really aware of the ways that, and I'm calling it basically disconnected practices, right? For me, it has landed with how important, there's a mountain of evidence from multiple fields showing how important connection is for us as human beings. And so instead of thinking about just, what bell hooks would call the capitalist patriarchal, American context, to really acknowledge that at the end of the day, there are ways that humans divide each other. And those divisions create disconnection. And perhaps that is my compass. And when you're speaking to the casteist ways of those you just mentioned, Dorita, I think of that. I think of the ways that we divide each other and emphasize those divisions, and in that create disconnection. And so perhaps that is something that we can do when we're thinking about how to conduct research in various different contexts, is to figure out what are the ways that we are distancing ourselves and each other, and what are the ways that we can actually sort of bring each other in closer and see each other as full human beings to the extent we can. So I just wanted to say that.
I like your term is this disconnected practices, and the implications of that in relation to maybe highlighting differences and how that affects how we relate, no? If we highlight differences between Southern versus Northern knowledge, for instance, or even certain dimensions of class, are we furthering the distance, no? Quote unquote, while addressing fundamental issues? I mean, that's an interesting point. And I wonder, Kim, no, in your own experience, so how do you manage that unique position, no, of having that intersectional positionality of being trained in a certain tradition, but also part of your life, what's really happening in certain groups. I mean, how do you practically maybe manage or navigate those tensions? And maybe you can share that with the group, no?
I think what's also difficult and what makes it even more complex is how globalized our world has become. And so when I think about ideas that are rooted in quote unquote indigenous, are they really indigenous? How far back in time do we want to look, right? When we think about the movement of European colonization and its impact. And again, the fact that I'm speaking to you in English says a lot. The fact that we are having a global international conference in one language says a lot, right? About the historical events that have occurred. And that's something that we have to acknowledge. And I was actually wondering that myself about the Vietnamese historical roots, and I've been trying to dig into that. When were certain ideas presented? And because they've existed in this place for so long, when have they been taken as indigenous? What is indigenous? What is indigeneity? You know, that was another thing that was really complicated, because I think it's one word that makes it easy for us to say, oh, it's indigenous, and so it deserves this, it not deserves, but it lives in this space of like you can't critique it as much, right? And ideas have moved around the globe for a very long time. And so anyway.
That's a very interesting point. Wow, training in Sydney, you know, in a way for my PhD. So I guess that's the influence. I'm having always my primary and secondary is all in Malaysia. So there's a clash of that. But I guess learning from what you've said, Kim, I suppose if we take a stance from a learner's perspective, when you do qualitative studies, we really take a step backwards. You would say detached in a sense, but I guess it's really telling our participants that we are here to learn. You know, treat us like you're an expert. I'm not. I'm here to learn. So I guess that might create a little space, power, in the topic of today's ethics and the power between participant and researcher, and not so much our own identity so much. Although we are aware that our identity will influence us, but we keep ourselves checked. But how much we can check is really a skill over years, over years of training. And you know, one PhD is not enough. It's got going on 10 years of quality research to discover ourselves. So I guess I grow a lot through qualitative study because I grow with it over years and I discover myself more. And it might turn out to be, Nico, you know, it might turn out the global South and the global North is probably one thing. It's just we come to learn, and that unite us in some way. you got a good point.
Thank you, Tong. So time check, it's 6:52. We have 8 minutes left. Maybe if we have questions, comments from our audience before we move towards the closing. Comments, suggestions, anything? Yes, Michael.
Thank you. First, thank you for not just the presentation, but the discussion as well, because I think these are the kinds of things that will follow us. Now here is you know, my two cents on what the concept of indigeneity helped us, and here I'm speaking from a white European, US way of conceptualizing psychology. What it helped us over the last 20, 30 years now, at least, is to realize that our own, let me call that indigeneity of the way we embrace interiority in psychology and reflection on interiority, how much is that one particular tradition? And it is a tradition, it's not the way the world is, or we have to encounter the world just because our discourse, our Western Eurocentric discourse, is so much part of who we are and how we make sense of the world. So I think that's where indigeneity as a concept has become a good weapon almost to question and lead us into our own tradition. So I think that's one thing. So on the other hand, or in cahoots with this, there are certain aspects of certain parts of indigenous sense-making, like in the medical tradition, or like in the tradition, we heard that yesterday also, of nature, that are, I think, again, those are pockets, those are ways where, again, there is a critical orientation that, to a degree, at least, we could I'm speaking as a Eurocentered US psychologist, we can begin to play around with. We can explore, are there alternatives? That's what Martin Dege and we called it. Are there potential alternatives here that we just haven't realized the potential of it? So I think these two parts of having become ourselves more critical of our own traditions, and then at the same time, there are certain aspects, I think, that are, I want to call it, this is not a good word, attractive. Attractive in terms of playing with them, entertaining them, and exploring them in more depth. And in order to do that, I think we have to develop better, more open, qualitative methodological approaches to bridge this, to open this up. All right, this was a little bit more than 2 cents, but I think that's where I would like to see the qualitative field move to some degree at least.
Thank you, Michael. Your point on that continuous reflection on I think the multiple discourses of, in your case, the indigeneity, and the implications of that in our own work in doing qualitative research needs to be further pushed in terms of, regardless of where you sit in that position, right? I mean, following Kim's term a while ago, there's an inherent blind spot in specific intersections even, and more than recognizing, I'm thinking of how from recognition to transforming, but of course that leap is quite big and it will require a lot of effort from all disciplines, all perspectives in qualitative research. Any last takers? 4 minutes to go. 4 minutes to go. From our discussants, any last points? Anything that we have not covered? Of course, we have not covered in depth the teaching part, and of course, other issues as well, like publishing, the ethics of publishing in qualitative research, especially if you're coming from the Global South. There's also the issue of submitting your application to an IRB. And the IRB in the Global South are also trained in a certain epistemology and all of those. Those are interesting points as well that we can explore later on. Any last thoughts from our discussion? If not, we can call it a night. It's night here in the Philippines. Good? Are we all good?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I would like to thank our discussants, Tong, Kim, Augil, for sharing your experiences and insights concerning the ethical dimension of conducting quality research in the Global South context. I'm sure there's a lot of more discussion, exciting discussions to look forward to. I'm sure also our audience have also learned a lot. Looking forward to more discussions on ethics in quality research in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.